Hi, good morning, afternoon. My name is Jessica. I am Move to Amend's program director, and we have a kind of special situation today. This is Dr. Lianne Barnes.
Hi.
She's here to talk with us about the news of the week and make sense of it. She's also my wife, so we're in the same place today. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you for being here.
Yeah,
Really
happy to
appreciate
be
it.
here.
Cool. Okay, so let's start out with just reminding folks who might be tuning in for the first time what Move to Amend is and what we're all about. So Move to Amend is a national grassroots organization that is working to pass the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which says that corporations shouldn't have constitutional rights and that money is not protected free speech. We also, though, have a much larger goal, which is to create a more just and sustainable and democratic world. So we prioritize movement building and work that displays all the different ways that corporate power comes up in the world, whether that's in politics, in culture, in policy, and a million other ways. So that's Move to Amend. If you haven't signed the petition yet, make sure you go to movetoamend.org and put yourself on the list. So we're here to talk about making sense of this week.
Every week's a big week, I feel like. Right
Yeah, it was like a long year this week.
Yeah.
So we have a couple things to cover. I want to give a quick shout out to some struggles that are happening around the world that we're really tuned into and feel like are important to talk about. There was a debate last night, but
we're not going to talk about it.
It was nonsense and not really worth our time. Speaking of corporations running everything, just kind of two wealthy people yelling at each other about
who is more wealthy and who is more corrupt.
So that's cool. That's all we're going to say about that.
Yep.
I wanted to talk quickly about what's happening in Nigeria. So Nigerians are rising up against police violence and state violence and calling for an end to state violence through police, specifically about dismantling the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, which is a name for this government agency that is carrying out a lot of violence and kidnappings and extrajudicial killings and stuff that's very familiar. You know, of course, like our struggle in the States around state violence and police brutality is like not in a silo, you know, like connected to people struggling in this way all over the world.
Yeah, there are things unique about the experience here, but there are also things that are very not unique.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's like really amazing to see that swell of uprisings happening there. And it's a reminder too that we, are always connected to a global struggle. I think it's really easy in the United States because we're so insular and so like nationalistic in so many ways that it's easy to feel like we're fighting our own fight. But actually we're not, and we're connected to everyone else. So that's what's up in Nigeria this week. Definitely something to be paying attention to. What else happened this week?
We watched What the Constitution Means to Me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Really interesting.
So that's a play put out by Heidi Schreck, who is a author and playwright and constitutional thinker. What did you think about it?
I found it overall pretty hopeful that there's even a conversation happening around what is the Constitution doing for people? Is it correct? Should it be adjusted or abolished? Or, the fact that there's even a conversation happening, I think is great. I found it really powerful, particularly how she connected to her experiences and her family history of, this lineage of trauma, of violence against women. So I found that was a powerful way to relate to the topic.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that exactly. Like you know, we talk a lot about the Constitution, and I talk a lot about the Constitution with a lot of people, and I feel that really strong personal connection between like the violence and trauma that I've seen in my life and like the total inadequacies of the Constitution and the culture that it creates. But it's so rare to hear people talk about it like that, actually.
Yeah.
I thought that was really awesome.
Yeah. And I really appreciated her focus on the Supreme Court case about the argument of, she talks about the argument about the word shall in terms of whether the police have a duty to protect women from domestic violence, or if it's just something they can or can't do. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was a really interesting thing to watch and such interesting timing, because we'll talk about this in a minute, but of course this weekend we have the People's Movement Assembly coming up where we're going to talk a lot about those questions and the Constitution. So it just feels like there's really a moment happening around this question. And that was really cool. And like you said, the way is that, you know, there's a bunch of Supreme Court stuff happening right now and in the public eye. And it's like, it seems more clear than ever that it's not just about, you know, who it's going to be in that role of a Supreme Court justice, but like the fact that that court exists in that way and holds so much power, and that the Constitution being so vague, the United States Constitution then delegates all of this power to the judicial branch, which is arguably the least democratic branch. So I just really appreciated her perspective on that.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, there were some places where I felt she could have gone a little bit further, but I think that it's good to highlight this fact that, you know, the Supreme Court, the whole supposed purpose is to interpret the Constitution and to interpret law, but there are actually not checks on that. Like, there was a ruling that came out either this week or last week about voting rights, and that the Supreme Court ruled in a way that made it so that a state could sort of do some voter suppression, and they gave no explanation for their judgment, for their decision. So if you have no explanation, then how are you interpreting the Constitution? Like, that's their job, is to interpret the Constitution and give a reason why this behavior fits or doesn't fit with the Constitution. And they're at the point now where they don't have to do that. So they didn't. And the fact that they can do that is a big picture problem. Yeah, absolutely. It's a structural problem, not a personality issue, right? Yeah, it's not about who makes up the court. It's about the fact that the court can do that. Yeah, absolutely. I want to just take a minute to say hi to some folks who are tuning in. Your mom's here. Hi, Liz. Hi, Mom. And some of our affiliates. My sister's here. Hey, Daniel. Lots of folks. And some people writing in about the Constitution. This is awesome. I'm really glad that you all obviously have like strong feelings about that. So you should come this weekend. You know, and there's a huge and dense conversation to be had about this. We're going to try to make it really accessible and let you talk about, you know, how you think about all that. So glad to see that people are up for it. Yeah, and Jennifer asked, where can you watch that play? It's on Amazon Prime, of all places. Ironically. Okay, so the Heidi Schreck play, I think, was really super interesting timing, because not only is it talking about like the Constitution doesn't need to be renewed, reimagined in some way, but also she's talking about it through the lens of 4 generations of women in her family and gender-based violence. Is that an appropriate thing to say? Yeah. And I think that's a thing that we both think a lot and care a lot about. So I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about your work. You have been
an advocate for survivors for a long time. This month is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see the relationship between corporate power and domestic violence.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so a little backstory for me is that I'm a psychologist, a psychology professor, and I have done some research around sexual violence, and I've also done a lot of advocacy work in the realm of violence prevention and gender-based violence and things like domestic violence and sexual assault. So it's an issue that I feel very passionately about. So it was very interesting to see the combination of our two major passions in that play. Yeah. But yeah, so there is actually a very interesting connection between how the US responds to domestic violence. It's also called sometimes intimate partner violence, also called gender-based violence, and corporate power. And so this is a story that I'm not sure a lot of people know, actually, this connection. Yeah. So I want to make sure I get my facts straight, so I might look at my notes a little bit. But so there is, in 1993, a study came out of the CDC. And the CDC, part of their job is also to do research around public health. And domestic violence is considered a public health issue. But this actually wasn't about domestic violence at all. And it came from within the CDC, a sort of sub-agency called the National Center for Injury Control and Prevention. And if you haven't heard of that organization, just stay with me. So there was a study that came out where they were looking at gun ownership in homes, and in particular, guns being stored in homes, and incidences of violence. And what they found was that people who had guns in their homes were more likely to either die by suicide, or someone in their family was more likely to die due to some sort of domestic violence incident of some sort. So the finding, and this is a scientific finding that this is the case. We're not here to talk about whether or not guns should be in a home, or whether or not people should have access. That's not really, that's not actually the question here. The thing was that this was a scientific study that found significant results. They published these results in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the NRA did not like that one bit. And so what they did is they started a campaign, a lobbying campaign, to fight back against anti-gun propaganda, is what they called that. It's just a research study in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. It wasn't necessarily propaganda. Not saying that there can't be bias in science, but
that's not propaganda, that's a finding.
That's a finding, yeah.
Okay.
And so that was replicated, actually. So so they came out with that lobbying campaign. They got a particular congressperson on board. I think his name was Representative Jay Dickey, I think from Alabama or Arkansas, sorry. And so he added a provision onto the federal spending bill that gives money to the CDC. And his provision stated that none of the funds made available for injury prevention and control at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention may be used to advocate or promote gun control. So the funds can't be used to advocate for or promote gun control, which is not actually what that study was doing.
Right.
But but Congress passed this, and they reduced the CDC's budget by exactly how much money was going to the Center for Injury Control and Prevention. So the net consequence of this was that the Center for Injury Control and Prevention was immediately shut down. They lost all that funding, and so it was gone. Even though that's not what it said explicitly, they cut the funding by exactly that amount.
Right.
And so it's not that the CDC is explicitly not allowed by law to conduct research on gun violence, but it is effectively that the CDC is not allowed to conduct research on gun violence anymore, because of that process and how they, if they have any studies that come out that show gun violence or gun use in a negative light, it's interpreted as anti-gun propaganda, and therefore even more of their funding will be cut.
Wow.
Jennifer's asking a question here.
When they revoked that funding, what else was defunded? What did the injury prevention group focus on?
That's a great question. Yeah, so it had repercussions down the line. Gun violence was a major one, but there were other things that were covered in that, particularly in terms of other forms of interpersonal violence. So other types of, like other weapons, basically, that could be used, also got defunded. Now, the CDC did sort of pick this back up in other areas. So they do research on violence in other areas, but they are terrified to do research on gun violence in particular. And that's what people in the CDC say. In fact, when this whole thing came out with the NRA, which there was a question, and it happened in 1996, I believe. So the study came out in 93, NRA spent the next 3 years lobbying hard, and then this happened in 1996. But sorry, there was one other thing I was going to say about that. So when that happened, the guy who was in charge of that study, or in charge of that center that no longer exists, he was told that the NRA developed a file on him specifically, that they were like monitoring him, and they had a file. And so it got very scary for a lot of people at the CDC.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's such classic use of like leverage that corporations and big lobbies, like the NRA is one of the biggest lobbies in the United States. And, sure, they didn't maybe create the law, but like they did in essence, right? Like that is so powerful. And that's exactly how corporate power manifests, and how, when you consider money free speech, then some people have a whole lot more access to that, and some groups have a whole lot more access to that than others. And that's exactly how it comes out, right? Like these things that people might not even see happen because they're like pork barreling on some other law, or, they're subtle like amendments to other things that are totally unrelated sometimes. And then you end up with this giant repercussion that is so harmful. And like you're saying, like guns is like the frame, but this is so much bigger than just like guns. This is right. So there were massive implications of this. The study wasn't explicitly a domestic violence study, and the organization, the agency, wasn't a specific domestic violence agency. However, what that led to was a lot of those kinds of studies no longer happening. So they stopped conducting research around gun violence in general. And then because most domestic violence victims are killed by guns, and that is a fact, then that just, we can't keep up with the statistics. So our statistics in that way are pretty old, actually, because we can no longer really conduct that research. And the repercussions go even further, because the issue is that there can't be funding for anything related to that could be seen as anti-gun propaganda. But what a lot of people who aren't in science don't know is that in the US, most funding for research actually comes from the federal government. Even if you're at a private institution,
professors are expected to apply for grants and bring in grant money. So they're, whether or not they get tenure is based on how much grant money they bring in part. And most grant money in the US comes from the federal government. And for things like psychology and public health, a lot of it comes from the National Institute of Health. And that was implicated in all of this. So the National Institute of Health is also nervous to do any research on this. And sorry, Jennifer has a question. If the CDC were to further focus on gun-related issues, would they simply not have the funding, or would there be legal repercussions? Why were they afraid? Both, I think. So there's a good chance that their funding could be slashed even further. Pretty certain that their funding would be slashed even further if they did that. And I think that there could be legal repercussions because that is now codified into law that none of the funding can go for anti-gun propaganda.
Well, you have tried to do more research even than you've done on this topic, and have been met with a lot of resistance for a lot of different reasons. But this is not a thing that not only gets funded, but gets talked about a lot, because there's so many like red tape situations and just
yeah, for sure. It has been a challenge to do research on sexual violence in particular. Just the institutions are very scared, and even professors can be scared to associate their name with that topic. So yeah, there's a sort of general cooling effect that has occurred. And the implications go even further than domestic violence, because that also includes research on mass shootings. So the CDC is afraid to do research on mass shootings for the exact same reason. So there are pretty far-reaching consequences. And the NRA continues this BS. They, if you Google this, you're going to see an NRA page that pops up that says, is called Know the Facts about anti-gun propaganda.
What was it? Gun violence?
Yeah.
In quotes?
Yeah, they called it gun violence in quotes.
You can take out the quotes. That's real.
And Know the Facts. And so they are still going strong. And it even contributed to the Violence Against Women Act not being repassed. And let me look at my notes to make sure I'm getting the exact part of it right. The reason that it applies this prevention of any research on this prohibition on research on gun violence is that in 2012, Congress voted to extend that language to all Department of Health agencies. So it's now not just the CDC, it's every aspect of the Department of Health that can't do this kind of research. And again, the law doesn't explicitly say they can't do gun violence research. It says they can't fund anti-gun propaganda, but anti-gun propaganda is interpreted as any research that puts guns in a bad light, because the findings put guns in a bad light.
Right, and who's deciding what that means is the NRA, and probably all of the people who may or may not be sort of very important judges, who they're paying to interpret what that means. So
yeah,
it's just a giant brick wall.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we've talked about this a lot too, and I think Heidi Schreck, when she was talking about her experience, or her mother and grandmother's experiences with the police coming into a situation of domestic violence, is her grandmother was white, right? What happens when you add the layer of the fact that the people who are most vulnerable to domestic violence are people who are left in the margins in so many other ways, right? Mm-hmm. Queer women, especially bisexual women, trans people, women of color, sex workers.
People with disabilities actually have the highest rates of anyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's it just amplifies this incredibly violent situation that already exists. And then
Yeah.
And then puts up roadblocks to try to understand it even.
Yeah. And then at the other side is, nonprofits who are trying to do advocacy work, trying to do violence prevention work, trying to provide resources for domestic violence victims. Nonprofits, as Move to Amend people probably know, they're not rolling in dough usually. Some are, but usually not. And so they apply for grants as well. And so there's an issue there. And then also part of the grant writing process is being able to cite research that your cause is important, or cite internal findings that you've made a difference. And so they can't really do that because that research isn't happening.
Wow, I didn't think about that part.
Yeah, so on the side of the nonprofits who are trying to do work in this realm, it can be very, very difficult to get funding. And often what they rely on then is, the big, corporate-based philanthropies.
Right.
Because that's what they can get.
Yeah.
So.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's just absolutely wild.
Yeah. And so the NRA continues to lobby against things that they think might put guns in a bad light. I wanted to read a quote of what they said about that study, or these studies in general. They said, "These junk science studies and others like them are designed to provide ammunition for the gun control lobby by advancing the false notion that legal gun ownership is a danger to the public health instead of an inalienable right."
It's so exhausting because it's just so much bigger than guns.
Yeah.
Gun ownership is such a small part of
this conversation.
Yeah. And yet it's all made out to be this thing where most people have a really strong opinion, yes or no in one way on this, but they're missing just 90% of what this means.
Yeah. And again, I'm not saying that science can't be biased. It absolutely can, but there were no indications that this study was conducted specifically with an agenda to get, greater gun control.
Yeah, like Greg says, classic example of chilling effect of corporate power. Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
It's it's not always super straightforward, but the ripple effect is violent.
Yeah. Oh, so I was going to say about the Violence Against Women Act, which ran out. The Congress decided not to pass. The NRA is a good reason, is a major reason why. In fact, might be the reason why it didn't get repassed last year. And that is because they wanted, let me see if I can find this particular one, because there was a provision about, in the Violence Against Women Act, there was a provision about making it more difficult for people with domestic violence records to obtain guns. So that was part of the domestic violence, part of the Violence Against Women Act was people who have an official record of domestic violence, it becomes much harder for them to get access to a gun. And the NRA therefore lobbied hard against it because there shouldn't be gun control in their minds in any way. And so it got killed.
Wow. And then, I'm just thinking about the implications for undocumented people, who already are unsafe going to any authorities to report anything. Just thinking about the data, there's a quote or a comment here that says data is necessary to understand our world on a macro and micro level. Exactly.
Yeah.
And you're a data scientist. You understand why that's so important. And the numbers that are reported about domestic violence are compromised by all of these things, plus a million other things. And so it's so hard to get data anyway. And then that data is compromised because some people just are not safe coming forward.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's, so there's this legal policy research side of it. And then there's also just the cultural side. What is the cultural effect of saying this doesn't matter? Violence against these people doesn't matter, even though it's wildly common. And, that makes a difference in how people act and what values they hold and how they behave,
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel that if that was a more widely known fact about the presence of guns in homes, it's not that I think that, and again, we're not debating gun, at all. But like, it's not that I think that would make people want to have guns less, but I think that it would help people understand the actual like risk and danger to people in domestic violence situations. There's a lot of victim blaming for people who are in those situations. And in that play that we're talking about, What the Constitution Means to Me, Heidi Schreck, she said that that the most dangerous time for someone who's leaving a domestic violence situation is actually when they leave. When they're in that situation, it's when they leave is when they're most likely to be killed. And there is data and research supporting that is the case. And so, there's so much victim blaming that like, why don't they just leave? But when they leave, they're more likely to be killed. And when they're killed, they're usually killed by gun violence. Or as is the case that was talked about, and again, apologies for this is kind of triggering stuff, but the case that was talked about in the play, the abuser killed the children in that situation. And so like, I think that if people had a better understanding of that piece of it, and if that wasn't being stifled, the research on it, updated research on it, I think that could actually do a lot of good for victims who are in those situations and are often isolated because the people around them, first of all, that's a tactic of abusers to isolate them. And then if the people around them are like, I'm just tired of this, why don't you leave? So I think it's an important piece of this conversation in trying to reduce domestic violence and gender-based violence.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. That's a really important point. It's reinstalling into our youth who are coming into this realm of information and are impressionable that domestic violence is not as large of an issue as it is and can't even always recognize it. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's just, that's a major cultural problem perpetrated by corporate power. I mean,
yeah,
it's a whole other realm of violence that,
yeah. And, the Violence Against Women Act was so much more than the bit about reducing gun access for abusers.
Yeah.
So much more that was in that.
Yeah.
There's also a comment there.
Whistleblowers are not just men in suits. Everyone should have an avenue to communicate injustice. Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's so brave. I mean, whistleblowers are brave, right? And yeah, that's a brave act, no matter, especially if you don't have any power, right?
Yeah.
In your situations, victims are not just physically trapped, but also emotionally and psychologically. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's so much to that situation that a lot of people don't know. And so this is just one piece, but we wanted to talk about it just because it's a piece that's so connected to corporate power and the fact that, that people are dying in these situations and people are trying to get help, and the organizations that can help them have trouble getting funding because of the NRA. And this, like, if we trace it back so many steps, that it's hard to get that funding for them to provide this help for people who desperately need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Yolanda, good to see you. Hey, Liz. Yeah, I think that's totally right. And Daniel said something earlier about like domestic violence plus policing too, right? Which we kind of touched on, but like, I mean, there's a lot we could say about the connection between domestic violence and policing on a macro and micro level, which are like super related.
Yeah, they really are. Like I said, I've done a lot of advocacy work in this realm. I worked at a domestic violence shelter for a while, and pretty much every person at that shelter had a story about the way that police responded to them. Either, the police got called and they arrested the victim, was really common, or they didn't show up, or they showed up 2 hours later. There pretty much every survivor that I worked with had that experience.
Yeah, super common. Not to mention just, I mean, the culture of policing itself and how statistically, like, the numbers of officers who are violent in their own homes is way higher than the average, like, public.
That is true. Yeah.
So
the number who are in some way legally affected by that is much lower. So they are more likely to be abusers and less likely to face any repercussions. So
it's a big, deep problem.
Yeah.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate this because, you know, at Move to Amend, we talk a lot about how, like, we're dismantling corporate power. We're going to pass this amendment, like constitutional stuff, but also that requires us to be simultaneously dismantling institutions like white supremacy and patriarchy. And a lot of times people are like, how the hell is patriarchy related to corporate power? And, like, here's a really straightforward example of the way that women and non-binary people and, you know, people who are not protected in general by our culture and laws, you know, get hit the hardest. And, like, this is a policy implication of patriarchy, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
In a really straightforward way. So there you have it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Shelley.
Is there no chance that the Violence Against Women Act can finally be renewed? What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, like, now we're getting out of my realm of expertise about policy. My feeling is that if that provision was removed, then it might be possible to get it passed, but that advocates for it on the other side are saying this provision is actually really important if someone has a history of using, you know, any violence, you know, and using physical violence against their family, then maybe they shouldn't be able to have a gun in their home. Like, that is somewhere that I will state my position about this. I think that is how it should be. That's a boundary, you know, like there are a lot of things in the world that you can have it until you abuse it and then you don't get it anymore, right? Like,
yeah, like that. Don't hurt your family seems like a pretty low bar.
Yeah. Seems pretty important here. That to me, I think that's fair. And so the advocates are saying, like, this is an important piece. So they're being asked, you know, like, which is so often the case in our country when we're dealing with, you know, people who are fascists, we'll just say that. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I have to switch from my teacher role to, like, here, I can say this. And,
yeah.
As a teacher, I just need to lead my students there. But people who are fascists, like, you know, they take a step back and then they say, meet me in the middle, right? And so that's, I think, what's going on with the Violence Against Women Act is that, you know, if you remove that, maybe we'll pass it. I don't know that they would. Maybe then they would be like, well, actually, you also need to remove this other thing and this other thing and this other thing. So I don't know. But I think that the NRA definitely has it out for the Violence Against Women Act.
Yeah. And Greg made a good point here too. And patriarchy is connected to militarism. Absolutely. Right. We can't talk about domestic violence without talking about policing, without talking about militarism, right? It's all the same culture of violence that is inevitable in a system like capitalism, where the most important thing above all other things is profit and property. So of course, when that is the holy grail of a society, but, like, that the cost is human, and the human cost is going to be those who are already marginalized, most vulnerable.
Yeah, and vulnerable. Yeah, absolutely.
God damn it. So that's rough.
Question from Jennifer. I know it's difficult, but do you have any guidance for younger people like myself just coming into this and feeling overwhelmed, how we can actually help to make a change? Yeah, Jennifer, that's a huge thing because, you know, again, I'm a psychologist, so I know that when we feel helpless, it's really damaging to us, and they want you to feel helpless. They want you to feel like there's nothing you can do about it. And then we end up with something called learned helplessness, where we just stop trying anymore. And so there are things you can do. You can absolutely get involved on the front lines of things like domestic violence. There's advocacy work you can do in that realm, volunteering for them, volunteering for crisis lines and things like that. And that's just the frontline small picture. The big picture is actually what Move to Amend is doing, trying to reduce the corporate power to be able to do things like this, to be able to buy Congress people and get them to be their tools, basically. So working to control corporate power, I think, is the big picture, how we fix something in the big picture. So getting involved with things with Move to Amend, I think, is another way that you can really make a difference.
Yeah.
There's one other piece of the story that I wanted to tell y'all, which is that in 2015, this congressperson who introduced the original provision that started this whole chain of events, he said that he regretted doing it because he wished they had the research.
Thanks. Super helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, we wish that too.
Yeah.
Okay, well.
Yeah.
Some things you can't just apologize your way out of, but whatever.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that the research itself isn't, research can be used as propaganda and can be biased, but just conducting research, I know not everyone is a scientist like me, but I don't think it's a bad thing. If what you find isn't what you wanted to find, that's even more important for that to be out there, because it's about trying to figure out what's the truth in the world.
Yeah.
And so you can't just decide that it's not the truth and stifle it to make it be not the truth.
Right.
It's still the truth. We just don't have proof of it anymore.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
Yeah, which is sort of a common fascist tactic. That's something that the current administration has done about research related to trans people. They cut funding and stifled that. And they are doing the same thing with the census.
Right, yeah, they cut that off early. Because, yeah, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
It's so funny because just last night, didn't we hear Trump say something again about well, we only have more cases because we have more tests? It's well, okay. that's okay.
Yeah, it's this idea of I don't want truth to be that way, so I'm going to suppress or manipulate numbers so that truth isn't that way.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's not science.
Yeah. And if you want to see how important research is, just look at how hard the administration is fighting to mess up the census and to not accurately count people.
Right.
They are trying really, really, really hard to do that. And the Supreme Court is letting them, again, because that's how important this stuff is. Getting the accurate numbers is really important.
Well, we should circle back on that because
Daniel,
humble brag. Not everyone's a scientist like me.
Daniel, you created humble brag. So.
I think we were talking about this last night. How we've got a potential new woman Supreme Court justice. And there is a lot of talk about how, representation matters so much, right? Feminism, you just need women to do things. That is wrong. Okay, you could have a Supreme Court of 9 women and they're still unelected, unaccountable, and serving life terms. It doesn't really matter so much as creating more democratic situations, right? Yeah, representation matters. It does, right? Like we know this as queer people who watch TV. Like we understand the importance of representation, but we can't mistake feminism for just putting women in positions of power. That's not that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was, I think, my biggest disappointment with the play, What the Constitution Means to Me, was that was sort of, you know, like presented like a punchline. You know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's comment about when will there be enough women when there's 9. And like, yeah, it's not that representation doesn't matter, but when we're talking about politics, policies matter a lot more.
Yeah.
And you know, like, I think that part of the reason people hold on to that idea so much is because the system is broken. It seems impossible to try to fix. We feel helpless to try to fix, like Jennifer was pointing out. And so this is being like, well, at least we could try to make the system that's broken work for us by having all the women, and hopefully those women would be better than having it be all men. And I understand that, and I get that, and I see why there's such an appeal to that. But the system is broken. Like, just the system itself around the Supreme Court in particular, I think, is broken. And that needs to be changed, as Greg puts so eloquently here.
Yeah. It's not just changing people, it's changing structures. That's exactly right. And, you know, and so this is of course ties back to the whole conversation we're having about constitutional renewal and total structures change, because the Supreme Court, like, what's broken is the whole goddamn idea, you know, but the Supreme Court was set up that way, right? So like it's working how it was intended in some ways, right? Like, a lot of people say, like, it's not broken, it's fixed. You know, it's true. It was created to be a filter between the public and decisions that are being made by the government. That's not a secret, right? The people who framed the Constitution really wanted to keep the riffraff, the working people, out of government stuff. Don't worry about it. And so that is like, these filters were created, and they give us very little access to democracy, right? If we think about democracy as a verb, the participation in structuring the way that our world works, it's completely anti-democratic, you know, like, and so another thing you could do about it is to be bold enough and brave enough to reimagine things in a much radically better way, right? Because actually the whole root of this tree, of which domestic violence and, you know, all the other impacts that we're seeing are branches of, what we need to do is major overhaul and systems change. And that's part of what we're talking about this weekend. I'll just transition into a plug quickly, which is starting tomorrow morning, we're going to be having a 2-day-long virtual assembly. Everyone's invited, as long as you're down to have a conversation about reimagining the US Constitution. We want to have you there. So that's called the People's Movement Assembly Towards a People's Constitution. And we're going to be talking about all of these things in terms of, like, what are the structures that are creating the implications that we're all feeling so deeply right now? And what would it be like to, like, have a constitution that, I don't know, protects people over property? That's a radical idea for some, right? And speaking of just changing structures and not people, like, we want more than a female president, right? That's not the change we're talking about. That's representation, but that's not good enough. We want to think about, like, is there something more democratic than, you know, having the illusion of a democratic election to elect a woman who is going to, you know, incarcerate a lot of people and deport people and kill people, and, you know what I mean? Like, it's a systems problem. So if you feel that and are driven to want to think about making systems change on a structural level through constitutional renewal, or at least learning about it, you should come this weekend. You go to movetoamend.org/PMA. You can read through kind of the assumptions we're bringing into the weekend and what it's going to look like. But it's the same problem we're talking about, which is policy, structure, and the cultural implications of that, which are just violent, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So movetoamend.org/PMA is a thing. If you don't do anything else on the internet today, do that. So let's see, is there anything else that we wanted to talk about with all of that? Is there anything else you want to say about Domestic Violence Awareness Month or anything like that?
Not so much about that, but I was thinking that I feel, you know, what I was saying about that we want the broken system to work for us. Maybe it's just because we're in Vegas now, but I feel like people sort of respond to the Supreme Court and to elections in the US like a rigged slot machine. You know, they keep thinking, if I just put in a little bit more, maybe it'll work. And then sometimes it does. You know, sometimes the Supreme Court comes out with a ruling. You know, we are personally very affected by a Supreme Court ruling that is in our favor. Sometimes that happens. And when that happens, people are like, ah, yes, okay, like this is good. It's working. And then they put in another coin and they lose again and again and again. And so I feel like we're just sort of like being kept on the string, you know, of variable ratio reinforcement is what that's called. Yeah. Where people are just hoping that maybe next time we'll win big. Next time will be big money. And it's not, it's rigged.
It's a really good metaphor for it. And as people who live in Vegas, we know that you just lose. You're not gonna win in the long run.
Which, side note, but related, one of my colleagues does research on gambling addiction and was literally told by someone at the university, like, you're not gonna go too far on that, right? Because, you know, UNLV relies on funding from locals in Vegas, and I don't think they'd like it if you go too far with your claims about gambling addiction. So this is a problem everywhere in terms of suppressing facts.
Yeah, that seems like a theme.
Yeah. Wow. Greg says, unfortunately, most of the time the result is snake eyes. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
It's not big money.
Yeah, that's good. I hadn't heard that one before. I like it. And Jennifer says, this is probably not by accident. Yep, not by accident at all. Super intentional and masterfully crafted.
Yeah. So yeah, that wasn't about domestic violence per se, but I am really glad that there are people who are listening and care. This is a topic that's really, really important to me. I actually had a friend who was murdered through gun violence by his abusive father when we were 13. And so there's other ways that this is very near and dear to our hearts. And so it's really exciting to see and get a chance to show people these connections and why corporate power has gotten its little fingers into so many things and has impacted the lives of so many people.
Yeah, in ways that the amount of small ways that this and big ways that it shows up in our lives. And I think that's why it's frustrating to me when ideas about corporate power and getting money out of politics and amending the Constitution get stuck in a really intellectual space, because this is as personal as it gets. I mean, that's your body and your home. That's as personal as it gets.
Yeah.
So I think this is really important. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So there's like a lot of bummer there, but
sorry.
No, but that's like so important. And that's also like, that has to motivate us. And I think an important understanding of domestic violence awareness that just doesn't get talked about that much. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank y'all for listening.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I want to end with a like hooray moment, because we do get wins sometimes, and sometimes those wins actually come from like people and not just illusions of like a good moment. So this week in Bolivia, Wow. So Bolivians have been fighting against the US-backed coup since late last year, and have, truly centuries of like indigenous wisdom and organizing to create the amount of people power that it took to win this election and put like socialist back in government. And that was a really amazing moment for Bolivian people and like a lot of celebration. So that gave us some life this week. And,
and again, about that play, but even though they I feel like we're spoiling things for people, but if you haven't seen it yet, but they do this debate about whether the Constitution should be kept or abolished, and they ask an audience member to choose. And even though the majority of the time people say keep, it was pretty exciting that this is discussed at all, and that there actually are a pretty good number of people who are like, oh, you made good points about why maybe it should be abolished. And that was really hopeful to me, because it feels like it seems to a lot of people so like sacred, in that it shouldn't be touched or messed with, which is not really how most of the world that has constitutions thinks about constitutions.
Yeah, I mean, spoiler, the average lifespan of a constitution is 19 years, right? So ours is very unique in that way.
Yeah. So it's exciting that there's a conversation where people, it doesn't actually have to be that radical, even to just be like, hey, maybe we can update this stuff. Maybe it needs to be just looked at again. Like that's not people. Most people, I think, previously have thought of that as very like, anti-American.
Yeah.
And so it was nice to see that a lot more people are interested.
Totally. And there I think there was a lot more like pearl clutching 10 years ago, if you were to say this. And that's not how most people in the world relate to their constitutions. Exactly. Unique and outdated are now one and the same. Your words, not mine. And then I just wanted to give a shout out to the people in Thailand who are in the midst of a massive uprising, which includes a demand for a new constitution, as well as an end to the monarch's like legal immunity, and calling for a redistribution of funds and power from the monarchy, which is a huge deal.
It's a huge deal.
Like Thai culture seems to be very reverent of the monarchy, right?
Yeah.
We learned that when we were there. Like you don't say anything bad. So
that's really exciting.
There's a lot going on. Definitely our eyes are on Nigeria and Bolivia and Thailand right now. And here we are in the middle of our own moment. Really hope you all will come this weekend to the People's Movement Assembly. A couple other things coming up here on Wednesday the 28th. So next Wednesday, we've got a monthly live report on Facebook and Twitter that we do each month, updates about Move to Amend. So tune into that. That's 5 o'clock Eastern on the 5 o'clock Pacific on the 28th. And then October 30th, we are having a really fun, what we're calling a Fright Night, Racism, Corporate Power, and Other Horrors. We're going to show a horror movie and another clip of another one, I think, and have a conversation about corporate power and like the horrors that creates, which we kind of also did today. That's
a little bit.
So it's spooky season. We're gonna wear our PJs and pop some popcorn and watch movies together and talk about corporate power. It'll be really fun.
Cool.
So I hope you come. And let's see. Just another invitation to sign our petition if you haven't already, movetoamend.org. That signing the petition just puts your name on our list and adds your name to a call to amend the Constitution. It's really helpful when we go in and lobby our legislators to show them like this many people in your district want you to do this thing. So it's not just like signing a petition like you get a million of in your inbox every day. It's a tool that comes in really handy for making change. And then I'll just say that, there are a lot of ways to plug into the movement. There's a million things that you can do. One of those things is to support us financially. I mean, Move to Amend doesn't get any money from corporations or giant foundations or certainly no political parties. So we are scrappy and we all have thousands of donors who give us like a little bit that they can every month, and that goes a long way. So if you can become a monthly sustaining donor, that's what gives us the most stability. It allows us to foresee our budget for the following month and then plan accordingly. So the most helpful financial thing you could do is even just give $5 or $10 a month, movetoamend.org/donate. It goes a really long way. Right now, most of us on staff are working as volunteers since COVID sort of started to lighten the load. We're finally starting to hire people back. Thank you for those of you who have stayed with us through this really difficult time. And then I'll just give a shout out to the Movement Education Program, which is an online free curriculum that we've designed to talk about the intersections between corporate power and lots of other issues, including movement history and how sort of racism and patriarchy and all of these things have come in and disrupted so many people's movements, and how we can be stronger if we learn those lessons moving forward. So it's free, and you can sign up at our website too, that is linked right there on the screen. So that's what we got. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you
for having
talking
me
about all that. And
yay, Jennifer.
Yay, thanks for sign that petition. And I will see, hopefully, you all tomorrow, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, for the People's Movement Assembly. I'm really stoked, and I can't wait to see you there. Ready for lunch?
Yes.
All right.
Bye, everybody.